Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel Frontline News. Today we're diving into a story that feels almost unbelievable, how the Ukrainian resistance is steadily breaking through what many considered the impenetrable frontline held by Russian forces. This is not just about tanks and trenches. It's about ingenuity, morale, asymmetric warfare, local knowledge, and a will to win that refuses to fade. Let's start with the stage being set. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia stretches back over a decade, but exploded into full-scale war in early 2022. Russian forces had built deep defensive systems, fortifications, layered minefields, and networks of trenches across southern and eastern Ukraine. Many analysts believed that breaking these lines would require overwhelming numbers, cutting-edge equipment, and huge resources. Yet Ukraine has found ways to chip away, not always from the front, but from behind, from the side, and by making the defenders' strengths into weaknesses. One of the core factors has been Ukraine's use of local resistance, underground networks, and partisan operations inside Russian-occupied territories. Groups such as the domestic underground movement called Popular Resistance of Ukraine have been critical. These are not always glamorous, headline-making blitzes. They are intelligence gathering, sabotage, sleeper cells, and a psychological campaign. The fact that these networks exist and operate matters enormously. When an occupying force knows that the population does not accept them, that their logistics are vulnerable, that they are watched from within, then their safe rear is no longer safe. Consider the case, partisans in Russian-controlled zones blowing up rail lines or sabotaging supply routes. These actions may not retake a city overnight, but they begin to fracture the operational logic of the invader. For example, in occupied southern Ukrainian regions, there have been coordinated attacks on supply lines and rear areas. Once the logistics backbone is weakened, the frontline units start feeling it: delayed ammunition, interrupted fuel, reduced mobility. And then there is Ukraine's conventional military side leveraging this. Under heavy pressure, Russia has repeatedly failed to break Ukraine's defense or exploit its advantages fully. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War note that Russia has failed to break Ukraine, despite enormous firepower and manpower. What's remarkable is how Ukraine has used asymmetric approaches to tilt the fight. One key domain has been drones. Small, agile, relatively cheap, yet able to strike high-value targets, gather intelligence, provide real-time visuals. These have given Ukrainian forces a flexibility that Russia's more massive, slower system often lacks. At the same time, Ukrainian forces have exploited terrain, cover, concealment, and surprise, difficult things in classical mechanized warfare, but available in a conflict of attrition and fluid lines. Another factor is morale and national determination. Armed resistance is not sustainable without a sense of purpose, belief, local support. In many occupied areas, the population has silently or openly resisted. The historical memory of partisan warfare, the will to still belong to the Ukrainian state, all feed into this resistance. Academic work notes how civilian resistance in Ukraine has been of huge assistance to the Ukrainian military effort. Combine this with the professionalism and changing tactics of Ukraine's military and a broader international backing, and you get a force that is increasingly adaptive rather than static. Let's go step by step through how this breaking of the front line is happening. First, undermining logistics. The invader relied on long supply lines, rear areas perceived as secure, massive fortifications meant to channel and resist advances. But Ukraine and its resistance networks targeted these rear zones: railways, bridges, ammunition dumps, command nodes. A disrupted supply chain means less artillery, less reinforcement, less ability to rotate units, less ability to hold ground. As an example, the elaborate Russian defensive line known as the Surovikin Line represented one of the most extensive fortification systems in Europe in decades. Yet even that line is being stressed by Ukrainian tactics that avoid the strongest point head on and instead attack the soft tempo behind it. Second, targeted attacks and local offensives. With the logistics increasingly vulnerable, Ukrainian forces have more space to maneuver. Localized offensive operations can create rupture points in the enemy system. Rather than trying in some cases to assault the strongest point, Ukraine has often looked for weak links, where terrain is favorable, where defenders' supply is thin, where the morale of the occupying force is low. Combined arms, drones, precision strikes all feature. Over time, this creates a pattern. The front line begins to shift, even if slowly. Third, psychological and political impact. Breaking a front line isn't only about territory, it's about perception. If an army believes the enemy can't be defeated, it fights differently than if it believes the enemy is increasingly adaptive. When Ukrainian partisans inside occupied territories hang banners, strike symbolic targets, show capability of hitting deep inside the occupied zone, this sends a message. Resistance is real, control is contested. This influences the occupier's calculus. More troops may be needed to secure rear areas, more resources diverted away from the front. The cost of occupation grows. Fourth, adaptation and West support. Ukraine has benefited from military support, training, intelligence from Western partners. But more than that, it has shown an ability to adapt. Early in the war, Ukraine suffered from material shortages and weak air power. But over time, Ukrainians learned to integrate what they had with innovation, drones, remote systems, asymmetric war. This has enabled them to punch above weight. The support has given Ukraine a growing margin to run the kind of operations that wear down a larger adversary. Fifth, the erosion of defenders' advantage. Conventional wisdom is that defenders have an edge, fortifications, prepared positions, shorter logistics. Yet defenders also must hold, must maintain morale, must supply, must rotate troops. Over time, if the defender is leaking capability, overstretching, distracted by counterattacks, the edge begins to fade. That is what is happening here. Russian defensive networks are not static, they are under pressure. The Ukrainian resistance plays into that by forcing the invader to defend not only the front but also the rear. The need to secure supplies, communications, local collaborators, and suppress partisans drains energy and focus. Now, let's illuminate some of the challenges and nuances, because the story is not simple or uniformly positive for Ukraine. Breaking through a front line is a messy, costly, gradual process. Terrain, weather, minefields, artillery, manpower losses all pose limitations. Even as Ukraine wins tactical victories, strategic breakthroughs require consolidation, logistic sustainability, and political cohesion. Russia still holds significant advantages in numbers and heavy equipment, and the line is long. Any shift is covered by multiple defense layers. The offensive operations often proceed in fits and starts, so this isn't a clean story of steamrolling the enemy. It's one of steady pressure, adaptation, attrition, and in the end, of creating opportunities. Another point, while the resistance and partisan operations are gaining attention, they are also inherently risky. Operating behind enemy lines means exposure, brutal reprisals, intelligence vulnerabilities. The success of these actors often remains hidden, and the cost in human terms is high. Local collaborators, forced labor for fortification construction, occupied civilian populations all complicate the picture. But the fact that the movement exists and influences the conflict is impactful. Let's touch briefly on human geography and terrain. In regions like southern Ukraine, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and the Donetsk-Luhansk region, the terrain is open compared to mountainous zones. That means tanks, open fields, but also airspace and drone dominance matter. River crossings, marshland, wooded strips, minefields, these all shape operations. The Russian defenses used the terrain, fortifications, and mine belts to slow Ukrainian attacks. But the Ukrainian resistance and military have exploited areas less expected. Rear supply hubs, logistics nodes, transport network vulnerabilities, and local knowledge of occupied terrain. This is an example of indirect strategy. Instead of hitting the strongest point, strike the weaker links and build momentum. To see the broader strategic impact, as Ukrainian forces reclaim or threaten key logistical hubs and supply arteries, the Russian side must divert forces, secure its rear, perhaps pause offensive operations or reinforce defense, which gives Ukraine time to reorganize, gain more equipment, train, incorporate captured material, and consolidate gains. A front line isn't something static, it is a shifting line of contact, supply, morale, and terrain. If one side fails to maintain the rhythm of reinforcement, supply, morale, the other side, even with less material, can gradually push. What does success look like in this context? For Ukraine, it might be incremental territory gains, forcing the opponent to withdraw or redeploy, making supply so costly that holding certain areas becomes untenable, winning the information war so that the opponent's will weakens, establishing zones of control that threaten the occupation logic, and convincing international partners to stay committed. For the occupier Russia, failure to adapt could mean being forced into reactive posture, overstretch, high casualties, loss of momentum, and eventually strategic withdrawal or negotiation from a weaker position. Let's give a hypothetical but plausible scenario to tie this together. A Ukrainian resistance cell in an occupied town identifies a key rail link used by the Russian army to bring in ammunition. They sabotage the link, delaying supply by days. The frontline Russian-backed unit begins to feel shortage, artillery shells arrive fewer, resupply trucks are stuck, drones harass the line. At the same time, Ukrainian regular forces launch a local offensive in a nearby sector where the Russian defense had assumed stability due to the supply link. With the defense weakened, Ukrainian forces pierce the line in a sector. News spreads, morale of the defender drops, the attacker's morale rises. The occupier may respond by diverting troops to secure the rear, relieving pressure on the front line but reducing offensive capability. This shifting of resources and momentum is exactly how a seemingly static front line begins to crack. It's also worth touching on technology and innovation. The younger generation in Ukraine, digital natives, have brought unconventional warfare methods. Drone swarms, remote sensors, networked intelligence, social, media, influenced information operations. These do not replace tanks and artillery, but they amplify effectiveness, reduce the defender's ability to ignore certain threats, and compress time. Meanwhile, the resistance networks have local presence, which gives them an advantage in intelligence and sabotage, something large conventional armies struggle with when operating in hostile territory. One cannot ignore the human dimension. Leadership, training, and institutional adaptability have improved within the Ukrainian military over the war. Combined with the civilian resistance, the compartmentalized intelligence networks, and the rallying national resolve, Ukraine is creating a synergy of regular and irregular forces. The enemy, by contrast, has faced issues of morale, manpower, logistics, and the challenge of a long war with high casualties. Analysts say that even with all of Russia's resources, the expectation of a quick or decisive victory has not materialized. What this tells us is that an asymmetric force not only survives, but can begin to break through a stronger opponent when it uses its advantages well. Looking forward, the question becomes, can Ukraine maintain this momentum? Can Western supplies remain consistent? Can resistance inside the occupied territories scale without being decimated? Can the Ukrainian military transition from penetration to exploitation, holding gains, creating favorable terrain for future operations? Because breaking a front line is one thing, holding and expanding a corridor is another. Will the occupier adapt and shore up its defenses faster? Will there be diplomatic or strategic shifts that change the calculus? The war is far from over. One key risk: overextension by the attacker Ukraine. If they push too far without supply lines secured, if they advance into terrain where the enemy still has strength, they risk heavy casualties and overstretch. Another risk: the occupier may adopt more brutal methods to secure the rear, tighten occupation, cut off resistance networks, and thereby reduce the effectiveness of partisan operations. Another risk: supply fatigue, political fatigue in supporting states, or distraction by other global crises. But despite these risks, the trend is clear. The narrative of an immovable Russian frontline is being challenged. The Ukrainian resistance and military are showing that through persistence, adaptation, intelligence, logistical targeting, and local knowledge, even a powerful occupying force can be pressured. That is the takeaway. Resistance is not just heroic, it is strategic. It forces the stronger side to react, to defend more, to waste resources, to shift from offense to defense, and over time that changes the balance. In summary, Ukraine's strategy is multifaceted, combining conventional operations with irregular resistance, targeting not just the front line but the lines behind it, exploiting terrain, morale, and logistics, adapting continuously, and operating with the support of the population and allies. The result is that the front line is no longer purely fixed. It is dynamic and increasingly in Ukraine's favor. Saying breaking the front line is not hyperbole, it's a description of a process in motion. So why does this matter? Because war isn't just about who has more tanks or missiles. It's about who can maintain momentum, who can sustain logistics, who can manage morale, who can use local knowledge, who can make the enemy bleed while preserving their own strength. Ukraine is showing how a smaller or less well-equipped side can, over time, erode the advantage of a larger aggressor through smart tactics, resistance, and adaptability. And to wrap this up, what can we learn from this beyond this war? That defense lines are as strong as the systems behind them: supply, morale, intelligence, adaptation, will. When those systems are targeted, even the strongest lines become vulnerable. That local resistance can matter hugely. People who know the terrain, know the language, know the context, make a difference. That technological adaptation, even with limited means like drones, sensors, communications, can level the playing field. And finally, that strategy, patience, and persistence combine to change dynamics. In this story of Ukraine, we see how a long war of attrition, adaptation, and layered operations is playing out, how a resistance movement is part of regular military success, and how a frontline in 2025 is less defined by static trenches than by movement, logistics, and will. Thank you for watching, and if you found this breakdown useful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts. What aspect of this conflict do you find most pivotal? The resistance networks, the drone warfare, the logistics battle, or something else? I'll see you in the next video.